Hi everyone, today we are going to sew the Jeanne Gloves, and Andrea is here to assist me, and she is also going to be doing the sewing today. So welcome, Andrea. Now we have minimized these pattern pieces down to 75%, so they probably look a little bit smaller than my hand, just so that you can see everything on our surface here. So first thing you want to make sure is that you're going to measure your 1-inch test square, and you want to be brutal with seeing if it is exactly 1 inch, because if it's even a millimeter off, your gloves won't fit. So make sure that you have a 1-inch test square, and if not, check your printer settings following the directions in the instructions. Okay, so we're going to show you the two-tone glove version today, and there's also a ruffle wrist version of the glove, which is the one that you see in tulle in the samples. So let's talk through the pattern pieces because they're a little different for each of the versions. So for both versions, you're going to cut these little finger gussets, making sure to cut to your finger length. So you're going to need to cut 2 of those for each finger. Now for the two-tone glove, you're going to be using your bottom fabric for the finger gussets. And then for the two-tone glove, you are going to cut your glove top. You're going to cut 2 in your top fabric, which you'll see we're going to be using a leopard print for that. And you're going to cut 2 of the bottom in your bottom fabric. And we're going to be using a hot pink jersey to really contrast between those 2 fabrics for you today. Now the thumb pattern is different depending on which version you're making as well. For the two-toned thumb, you need to cut 2 from your top fabric and 2 from your bottom fabric because there is a seam on the outside of the thumb. Now let's talk about the ruffle version. So the main glove pattern piece looks a little bit different for this. You can see it's 1 piece instead of 2 separate pieces. So the number 4 piece, you're going to cut 2 of your fabric. Then the thumb, oh, and actually I wanted to mention too, if you're going to be doing the ruffled wrist, you're going to want to cut on this shorter line. And if you don't want the ruffle, you can cut on the longer line. The thumb for the ruffle wrist version is cut on the fold. You don't have that seam because you don't have 2 different fabrics. So you're going to make sure to position this on a fold of fabric and then cut around these outer lines here and cut 2 of those on the fold. Finally, we have our ruffle piece if you're doing the ruffle wrist version. So you're just going to cut 2 of your fabric in piece 7. And that's it for your pieces. All right, let's talk through fabrics and supplies. So these gloves are made in a stretch fabric. We used a variety of stretch fabrics throughout our samples. First is this fabulous leopard stretch velvet. We also used some cotton jersey, and this is a great choice for your first pair because it's a little bit sturdier. Another cotton jersey in black. We used these 2 fabrics together for our two-tone version. And then we also used some stretch tools. Now, very important, you're going to be looking for stretch tool, not just regular craft tool that you get at Joann's. So speaking of stretch, let's talk about stretch percentages. All of these fabrics are fairly high in their stretch percentage. And just to review how you get your percentage, you're going to use a gridded ruler like this. You're going to take 2 relaxed inches of the fabric and see how far it can stretch. And if 2 inches stretch to 3, then that's 50% stretch. So all of the fabrics that we used are about 50%, maybe a little bit more even. Now you can be a little loosey-goosey with your stretch percentage. So if you find something that has more like 40% or even 30%, just go up a glove size, okay? So like always, you can adjust your size based on your stretch percentage, but this is what we used. Okay, other supplies. You are going to want a stretch needle for your sewing machine. We used regular polyester all-purpose thread for sewing in the machine. You also want to have a hand sewing needle threaded, handy, ready to go to do some hand basting. We really love to use silk pins really for everything in the studio, but they're especially handy for something like the gloves where you're using some delicate fabrics like tulle and pinning together tiny little pieces. You will want to have a length of 1/8 of an inch wide elastic for the ruffle version only. This gets sewn to the seam allowance and kind of cinches the wrist in at the ruffle. Okay, let's talk cutting supplies. We used a lot of them. You're going to want a rotary cutter, and this is to cut those that sort of pointed end of the finger gussets you want them to be very, very precise. And in fact, you want all of this cutting to be very precise, but the rotary cutter helps for those pointed ends. You'll want your regular cutting shears for the rest of the cutting work. And then you'll see Andrea using 2 different small scissors. You can probably get away with just one of these, but if you have a few of these on hand, like this small size that Kai makes, we like to use this in the studio. And then we also found that having an embroidery size was really helpful for snipping tiny, tiny little seam allowances. And then you'll want a pair of tweezers. You can, go to your bathroom and grab your regular, beauty tweezers. But Andrea found that she really liked these serger tweezers because of the angled tip and also because of the sort of serrated surface here, which helps you grip onto fabric. And these help you grab the teensy little seam allowances as you're sewing to make sure that they stay flush with each other. And finally, a specialty supply you will want for this project is some tissue paper. Now, 1/8 of an inch seam allowances plus stretch fabric, as you might imagine, can result in the machine kind of eating your fabric. So, and especially if your machine has a wider needle hole. So say you have like a 7mm or even 9mm stitch width on your machine, you're gonna have a wider hole and more room for the fabric to kind of get eaten in that hole. So we really recommend that you use some tissue paper, and you're gonna see how Andrea puts the glove pieces on the tissue paper and then sews through all of them. So you can just cut some rectangular strips of tissue paper like this. You can even use hair curler end papers if that's what you have handy. You don't need any special tissue paper. You can just go to your local drugstore and get gift wrap tissue paper. That's totally fine. So just something that's going to provide some stability to your fabric. So that is it for your supplies. So next you're going to see Andrea sew her way through these gloves.